Well, I want to welcome you to this lecture. This lecture is going to be on the wind. It would be of some advantage if you've already seen some of the other lectures I've done on the wind. This particular lecture is going to be more on the interreactions of the wind, that is to say how the wind works with the plants and the animals and so forth, and its effect. And it's going to be more the way that wind commonly looks on the ground. It's very important. It's not as obvious as when you have sand dunes and so forth, but I think after you've seen this lecture, you'll tend to see it even when it's not that stark, when it doesn't have that high level of contrast, and that it's still very important as part of the environment. And so we're going to start with this little mountain here behind me, and we're going to talk a little bit about it, and then we're going to go up and take a look at it. So let's get started. Now the first thing we want to look at is that the wind here has had an effect, and most people would drive right by it and not notice it. But if we look right in here, there's a little grove of yuccas. And we can see right there, and we'll zoom out so that you can see that elsewhere there's few, if any, yuccas in this mountain. Now this is the downward, or downwind, side of the mountain, and this little pocket is where dust and debris has collected, has changed the composition of the soil, and has done so to the liking of the yuccas. And so the yuccas can grow here where they cannot grow elsewhere. And so we have a small population of yuccas that can grow in this little pocket. And we're going to talk about that little pocket, this microenvironment, and why it's there, and the different things that happen because it's there. And so we can see, we'll just zoom out so you can again take another look at this small little pocket on the downwind side of a mountain, and that it has a little population of yuccas. And so we'll head on up and take a look. This lecture, as we had talked about earlier down in the valley, is going to be about this particular Yucca Grove and how it relates to the structure of the mountain and the wind. And one of the things we need to understand about all life, but in particular this example, this Yucca Grove, this isolated population, gives us a window into the population dynamics that's going on here in the desert. And with the yuccas, it gives us a population dynamics, a look at it on about a century or more level. But more correctly, it gives us a population census, if you will, on the scale of not a century, but on the scale of a yucca, the lifespan of a yucca. That's the scale that we're really talking about here. And once we understand that, we begin to be able to see what's happening here. Now, the yuccas have, like I say, this life force, and collectively this Yucca Grove has that. And again, we're not talking about a supernatural component. We're talking about a scientific, knowable concept. And this life force is such as basically it's in the seeds, and that those seeds are trying to spread this Yucca Grove out as far as it can. Another way to look at it is, in kind of modeling it, is if you take a a bucket of water and pour it onto an uneven piece of ground, it's going to spray out in all different directions. And that's kind of what's happening here with this Yucca Grove. You might have the prevailing wind blowing a lot of the seeds off into an area that has very little fertility, and very few of them ever grow. And once in a while a north wind or some other wind event or rodents or something take it the other direction, and while there are very few seeds that get this treatment, they go into a more fertile area and therefore grow, and this tends to mask what's happening until you start looking at it. You might have more growing on the north or the south slope. You might have a place where the soil from the wind is finer and more of it is collected. All of these things are affecting the shape of this Yucca Grove, and we can kind of walk through it and pick our way through it and get an idea of what's been happening here through the lifespan of a yucca. And so let's take a look. We'll zoom in on some of this stuff and see what we can find out. Well, as we can see, the center of it is where most of the yuccas are. They're the greenest ones. They're the largest ones. And with that, we can kind of find the center of this particular grove and how it's growing. And then if we look toward the edges, we can get an idea. For instance, this yucca, we could look and see that maybe 40, 50 years ago, something like that, about half the lifespan of a yucca or a quarter, things were correct for yucca to grow there. But beyond that, not much. We can see this one out here. If we zoom in, we can see it's a older yucca. It's not doing very well, and it's on the very edge of where a yucca can grow. Perhaps it got started in an El Nino many, many years ago, or was put into the earth by a burrowing mammal of some kind. Hard to say, but we can find that that is, in fact, the edge. And oftentimes, and I'm not sure if you can see it in the camera here, but where things are best for life, we can see that we get some hedgehog cactus and some barrel cactus, and other plants are also tuning in to this area that is better for life. It's just one of the many attributes that we'll find when we're looking at one of these little areas. Not unlike the fact that you get piñons and junipers together. So we have this little yucca grove, and it's trying to grow and expand, but at the same time it can only go so far because the various key elements of the environment, the soil, the wind, the rain, the sunlight, are all holding it, both holding it here and also aiding in its expansion. And it just depends on where the equation ends up. To this lecture on how the wind and the various other attributes are coming together in the desert, and we're going to try to get an understanding a little more in depth and how the wind is affecting the environment in this little hollow. Today is an overcast day, and we don't have many shadows, and I wish we did, because this shows up very well if it was timed right. But today we'll just have to work without it. And so the first thing we want to know is that, learn that this yucca, because it's grown, and the greasewoods and the other plants, they're affecting the wind themselves. And so there's that cycling situation where the wind is different because of this mountain. It's collected the dust and the dirt and the sand and the finer debris in the back of this hollow. We're down on the downwind side of this mountain. But then these plants have grown, and they too have put a little more drag on the wind, which means things settle a little bit more. And also the leaves and dead insects and so forth tend to stay if they get here or if they've lived here. And so this is holding all this dust because of the shape of the mountain. The shape of the mountain's affecting the plants, and the plants are making that effect stronger. But also, we have a situation where now that this yucca is up and as big as it is, has other effects. And so let's look at some of them. Of course, one of the major effects that this yucca is going to have is it's going to have a shadow. Now, if we look at the base of this yucca and we zoom in, we can see that on this side there really isn't that much growing. One of the reasons for this is that yucca actually has some reflectivity, and that reflection is causing the ground to dry out a little bit. Not much, but in the desert sometimes that's enough to make quite a difference. And if we look over here, we can see that the plants on the ground are a little taller. And the reason for that is because they're often in the shadow of this yucca, and that gives them just that much more time with the water, and so they grow better. Now, that effect, oddly enough, has yet another effect. And those small plants down there, if you were to get down and look very closely, you'd find yet smaller plants that are also living in that shadow. That is the shadow of the yucca and the shadow of these smaller plants when they grew. And so you have this effect, but it's not so much a feedback as it is an echo. And this is another universal phenomena that is needed to be understood. And basically you have the one shadow, you have these other plants growing, they in turn have a shadow which shades and gives just that much more protection from drying out to these other smaller plants. Much as if you throw a rock in a pool of water, you'll see the waves go back and forth until they end, or if you yell into a valley, that echo will come back and forth, and just each time it's more distorted and each time it's less. And with that idea that we have in the echo, we can see it over and over again in nature, whether it's a pool of water, with somebody yelling into a valley, or something like this, one shadow causing a plant to grow, the shadow of one plant causing another plant to grow, which gives shadow to yet another plant. And sometimes we have other actions and reactions that just keep on going. And one of the really beautiful examples of that is what we'll show you right here. And this is going to be a little different. We have to get a little more of a metamorphic metaphor idea. This greasewood here is growing, and in part owes its existence to the shadow that this yucca made. So this yucca has given enough shadow that at some point in time the seeds got into the ground and this greasewood got off and going on its own. Now, another way to kind of look at this, because this greasewood now, of course, has its own reflectivity. It has its own shadow that's going to have other annual plants and such grow in its shadow, and it's kind of magnified. And to give the analysis of an echo, it's kind of like somebody yelling into a valley, and then say a deer hears that and goes running through and crashing through the brush and causes an echo of its own. We don't generally think of plants in this way, but we ought to. But you have to think in terms of a plant's lifespan. You have to think in terms of centuries to see that their echo, their action-reaction, it's not as easily understandable as somebody yelling and then having a deer take off. That's something that's in the time frame of us humans and our human idea of thought. But if we stretch it out a little further and we learn from these plants, we'll start to see that they have these kind of actions and reactions. We just have to look and see it. And once you start to look at it, it's there. And it's just a easy way to kind of look at the desert and get some idea of the actions and reactions. Another way we can take it, another direction we can take this idea, is if we look right here, we can see that something's been eating some of them little yucca leaves. Now they're pretty tough. Not much can eat them, but they are edible, especially if you're a pack rat. And that pack rat is kind of, well, he's a constant companion, you might say, to the yuccas. It's kind of like the pinon and juniper. Well, if you got yuccas, you pretty much are going to have pack rats. And so that pack rat is here because the wind has deposited the right nutrients in the right soil to grow the yuccas. And now, because the yucca grove is here, the pack rat is here. And of course, once we have that, you're going to have your coyote and your bobcat and your eagles and so forth also coming by this little yucca grove looking for the pack rat. It's my belief that the yucca provides a source of green feed when there just isn't anything else. And of course then we can take that to the next level, because we're primarily talking about the wind and how it affects this small community of plants and animals now. And of course, if a eagle or a hawk or something was to come swooping down on our little pack rat, who's here because the shadow is here and the wind and that made the yucca grow, and the yucca has allowed the annual plants to prosper and so on. So he's kind of an effect of the wind. And now we have the hawk coming down, and of course his very shape of his body is shaped to the wind. His nervous system and his whole intelligence is designed by the wind. He feels every feather. He understands his place in three-dimensional space and all this, and can sense the wind and the air density, swoops down and gets our little pack rat and eats it. And of course it's where these two different, both ancient and the winds of the moment, if you will, all come together in that scenario. And we could take off in any direction from there, with the hawk going back to its nest, or perhaps the pack rat getting away, and so on. But in the end, we can follow a vein of knowledge, if you will, relative to the wind through all of this. Now, we could have done it completely through shadows or the sun or the makeup of the rocks and stone, or gone any direction we'd like. But this is the kind of, I guess you'd call speculative thinking that one can do to learn the desert. And with that, I thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you.